Hey folks, thanks for joining us. We're back with Connor Torres from Dotware Games. Connor, thanks for joining us. Connor's an awesome developer, educator, friend of the HQ. Connor, do you want to tell folks just a little bit about yourself and your kind of background with Unreal?
Yes, I am an Unreal Engine god. No,
yeah,
not
yeah,
yet.
we did make that
Aspiring.
joke at the beginning, like that Jerry Seinfeld intro where I would cue you up as the greatest Unreal developer. And we're like,
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
no, no.
Alberts was trying to do that
Yeah,
before, and
yeah,
I had to temper his expectations.
yeah.
So everyone, temper your
yeah,
expectations
yeah, yeah.
while we go into a few Unreal Engine topics. But yeah, Alberts, what do you want to talk about this video?
So I thought this would be a great follow-up to our discussion about player controllers and kind of that idea of separating logic around the controls and user inputs from, entities in the actual game. And I think in a very similar way, the game modes are kind of a tricky situation for folks coming over from Touch Designer and other apps because it almost feels in the same way of player controllers, like this higher level functionality that doesn't exist in our, I keep using the word flat for lack of a better word, but when we're coming from Touch Designer, we essentially have Touch Designer, like the program has some settings that save every time between opening new projects, and then we just have all the stuff in our project. So there's not really like a lot of hierarchy of like where states and controls and code can live other than like, is it in the app settings or is it like actually in our project? And I think this is an interesting thing looking at Unreal because my first impression is that it feels like it's got your app level settings of Unreal, then your project has a settings, then it's like you have game modes which are like settings of the game environment, maybe I could say with not 100% confidence for sure.
Yeah,
And then
per
and
map,
then there's the actual stuff in the game.
right?
So I'd love if you could kind of like in the same way that we were talking about the player control, like how would you approach understanding game modes as someone just getting into Unreal?
Well, I have good news, which is you don't really need to think about game modes too granularly. And once you kind of get what they are, which is essentially what you described, there's only really two examples I can think about where you're really messing with maybe two game modes per project. And
Mm.
that will be in the case of maybe having one area of your application where you need the mouse and it's like a main menu, kind of startup menu, and you're dealing with like that kind of stuff versus something where you're really like in the world. Those might be two fundamentally different game modes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, the game mode is simply a set of settings. There's like four or five of them where you tell Unreal, hey, this is the pawn or character. This is the player controller that goes with it. And then here's a few other things that you probably aren't going to use, like game state and game instance and things like that, which we can go into and talk about. But I would say probably
Mm.
for the touch designer community, you really don't really worry about that. You just set the default one. So let's actually explore this on screen here. So I've got this blank project right now. I am in world settings, and I can actually go to game mode override and override the game mode for this particular map. So you can do it on a per map basis, which
Mm.
you want, because one map might be your main menu, another map might be, your racing game, another map might be your awesome live stage show that controls, lights galore, etc. So you might have a different default game mode per map, and every map that you're in, you're going to be able to override that here. Now,
Mm.
it says override because the project itself in project settings has a default game mode. So I go to project settings and then maps and modes. You can see I'm going to be able to go to selected game mode and expand this. And there it is. Okay, what is the default pawn? Again, what is a pawn? A pawn is simply Unreal's word for the thing that you control, that you are in the world. Okay. It's not the controller. The controller is the one that does the controlling of the pawn. Player controller is the player's soul. Okay, it never goes away. It cannot be destroyed, but it can possess
Mm.
many things. The pawn are those possessible items, the car, the third person character, the flying top down view mode, whatever. It's a blueprint, it's a pawn. It means it's controllable. It can take in inputs. It gets possessed by a player controller. So your game mode, first thing you're defined in that is, hey, what's our pawn? Like, what is this the third person game mode for third person characters? Okay, then we're using a third person pawn. And then the HUD class, again, You could use it. You might not. Some of this kind of legacy, that's fine. Player controller, again, we talked about player controller last video. The where you would put some really universal stuff that is irrespective of the pawn. So you're specifying that in the game mode. And then the rest of this player state, game state, these sorts of things, you pretty much leave as at default. Let's add, by clicking add here, going to feature or content pack, some of Unreal's prefabbed game modes that have their own pawns and stuff. So we're going to go ahead and add the third person, just hit add to project. And I'll go ahead and add the vehicle one, add to project. So because I've added those to this project, I can very easily on this map here, this empty landscape with a cube sort of map that we did last time. It's giving me a little error. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect that, compile. It's giving me that error, by the way, because I tried adding this, and this template is expecting certain things in project settings, and we started from something outside this. So if you were like, but I want to make a racing game, just do a new project and then select the racing template on start. So anyway, fix that. Here I am in the world. If I were to hit play, I'm this sort of boring flying around kind of guy. But because I have these other game modes that came with those templates, if I were to go to the game mode override, I could simply change this to the, in this case, third person game mode. I don't have to do anything else. When I hit play, I am now that third person character. So you can see how useful this sort of collection of settings is, because that game mode just says when you spawn, you're spawning as the third person character blueprint, and you're spawning with this particular player controller, etc. Now you may notice, again, game mode, don't overcomplicate it. Like, there's only one unique thing about this game mode, which is what is the default pawn. Their player controller class is just that, vague general player controller. They have not even customized it. If you were to make your own game mode from scratch, you'd go about it like this. I'm going to go to blueprint class. I'm going to open up all classes here. Oh, actually, no, I don't need to do that. I got game mode base. Okay, we're going to call this, custom game mode. And you open it up. There's no coding required. It looks like a blueprint. There's no coding required. It's just going to be here, the details panel. You're going to set out, hey, what is my player controller? What is my default pawn? That kind of stuff. Now, these you might make yourself. So if I were going to, make some sort of custom player controller, again, I make a blueprint class. I do player controller here. And I would name this, in this case, custom player controller. And you're going to open this up, and it looks like basically nothing, because player controller is pretty much invisible, because again, it's that soul that does the possessing. But I could start, saying, hey, if I press the P key, past all the events. Alberts, do you remember your alphabet?
I'm one of those people who I have to say it from the beginning to get to the letter where I gotta figure out, because I can't start in the middle type of.
Okay, so then you would do your pause code here, because on the player controller, yay, we could pause from anywhere. So this would be how you would go about that sort of thing. Now I have this custom game mode. If I go to project settings, I could set that project wide for all of on my maps. Say, okay, no, you're doing custom game mode, and I can tell the game mode that I want you to use this specific custom player controller, and maybe this specific custom pawn if we were to make one.
So then, two kind of like quick follow-up questions as I'm digesting that is, the first one would be, is there somewhere that would be better between the world, I guess between the map settings and the project settings? Just really depends on how complex your project is. Like you were saying, if you have different maps that have different requirements, then you'd maybe set it at the map level. But I feel like for a lot of folks doing experiences, it's a lot of like one map, one level type of environments. So they could just set it in the project settings, there's no real difference between the two?
There's no problem with doing either or both. If you're just doing one situation, you only use one pawn, one player, you're not messing with all this stuff. Just set it in project settings and call it a day. And then just remember that at some point you decide, you have a main menu, which when you do a main menu in Unreal, that is going to be a different level. Generally
Mm,
speaking, you'll make a new level. It could be an empty level, file new level, and then you choose this like blank thing. But you name it
mhm,
main menu. And then in the world settings there, you might want to do your own custom game mode. And here's why. In the player controller here, so I made a custom player controller before. You can set the mouse settings, so automatically show the mouse cursor, automatically enable click events. These things are off by default because you don't want to have a mouse when you're playing in third person like this. But if I
mm.
were on some sort of application menu or something, now I just check those. Went away. Let's see. Oh, because we're in our third person game mode. Let's go ahead and change it to our custom game mode. Because I've set that on the custom player controller, and the game mode is going to force that player controller to be the player controller. When I hit play, I can't get rid of my mouse, and that's a good thing if you're doing a main menu. So just know that the override is there via world settings, but no, it's something, like I said at the beginning of this, not something you need to worry about too much at a high level.
Yeah, totally. And I think that leads into kind of where game modes I thought were involved, and maybe they are in some way, but I know one common thing that we always have a lot of trouble with coming from like Touch Designer and Notch and these other applications is that your application kind of has two modes. You have like the editor mode where I'm working, I'm building, I'm in kind of like the Unreal editor. And then we have perform mode, or basically like a display presentation mode, which is a little bit different because from the Unreal side, you are expected, I think, just because traditionally it's a game engine, like you're working, you hit play to test it, and then eventually you're going to package it and deploy it in some format. Whereas in our industry, that package and deployment part almost is like not something that I think most people need to get involved with. Because it sounds like there's some ways where you can just have the editor open up, automatically start playing, and full screen the result. Am I understanding that correct?
Oh yeah, I totally agree with that. If you're making games, you have to package at the end of the day. And
Mm,
essentially what packaging means is it's the same thing as exporting. You have to export your game from the Unreal Engine, or your application, your non-gaming application, from the Unreal Engine, so that it's an exe if it's Windows, or an app file, or some executable that you can then run independent of the Unreal Engine. And so that process in Unreal begins here. You go to platforms, and then you have the different platforms you could package it for, and then you hit package project, and then it begins this long, arduous
mhm,
packaging
mhm.
process. And that starts that process. But as you said, you don't necessarily need to package an application, and there's a lot of benefits to not doing such, given your use case. So if you're doing something like live stage events, and you need access to the editor, there is no problem with running the Unreal Engine independent of having some exe, and then you have the benefit of accessing the engine and not being beholden to whatever was packaged with your
Mm.
end application. So yeah, when you hit this play mode here, you are essentially running your game, but you're running it within the context of the Unreal Engine. If you're using Unreal Engine for things like virtual production or live stage stuff, yeah, there is no point in packaging the project thereafter. Packaging is for sending someone a piece of software that they get to interact with. If that's not what you're doing, then that's not what you have to do.
And then are there some quick tips that you have for, does Unreal have that kind of mode where you can say, hey, when I open the U project file, automatically just start playing the game, as if I hit the play button, and then maybe hide like the all the other outline and just full screen that main content area? Is that like something that Unreal does?
Yeah, so not when you open up the U project. When you open up the U project, you're still going to open it up in Unreal Engine, but thereafter, you can do some things so that
Mm-hmm.
you're not seeing the editor, so to speak. So if we hit on play here, you're going to get just kind of in the editor sort of play mode. But if I were to hit F11, this is going to expand
Yeah.
it. So F11 is your shortcut for doing that kind of thing. And then F11 to go back. The other option, there's a few, is I click on these three dots and I do a new editor window. And this is going to give me, though, that application bar at the top, which might not be what you're hoping for or want, but this is one other way of doing it. And then,
Mm-hmm.
of course, you can do a standalone game, which is, the closest to exporting it, which is why when I hit that, it's actually going to take a second because it's got to load in all this data because it's running the application in its own process. And
Oh,
if you were to do,
interesting.
yeah, so this is the closest you're going to get to packaging
Hmm.
without packaging. And
Yeah.
sometimes weird like idiosyncrasies that are only applicable to packaging will only show up here. So it's good to do this every once in a while if you're developing an application in general, because you don't have to package the thing to kind of see what the package project looks like, whatever.
Hmm.
It's also the best way to test true performance. So if anybody's working on really getting really crappy performance in the engine, in the editor, you might not be doing anything wrong. You should really play in standalone and then do that performance testing. So yeah, I'm gonna see if it might open up my other window, but nope, it's
And
still
then,
loading.
yeah, while that's loading, I guess another question is how much of these steps are automatable? Because something that's real common in our industry is like I'll set up a computer plugged into the LED wall on the outside of a building, and like with Touch Designer, what we'll do is we'll just set the computer automatically restarts itself 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, boots up a little bat file, runs the project file, project opens up, automatic full screen takeover, and then the content's just there, and then like no one ever has to like touch it or interact with it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, does Unreal have those kind of areas where is there a button that, or like if we build this standalone, is there a way to just always launch that instead of coming into the project first, or is there a way to come into the project and have it full screen itself automatically?
If you were to come into the project and then let's say hit that play, but you want to full screen, there's the Unreal Console commands. So the
Mm.
console command, you can set the resolution of the window. So set full screen or full res. You'd have to Google it. So you could set to a specific pixel ratio that you know the monitor is 1920 by 1080, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's if you're doing it with the console command. So you would call that console. The node is called console command, and then you put in the console command. Again, all Googleable. You run that on begin play. So as soon as you hit play, okay, it's all situated. It's one way, but to go deeper into what I think your use case is, which is, I open up Unreal and then it just launches the application. You might be looking at some sort of custom bat file for that, like you
Mm.
were saying, somebody to script essentially the launching of the play button, hitting that, but simulating a user doing it. The third way that you could probably approach that, it would take a little bit of research, but it's a noble thing to look into, would be Unreal Engine's editor utility widgets. Editor utility widgets are about, I want to say like maybe 3 years old, 4 years old in Unreal. They came in sort of towards the end of UE4. And
Mm.
what they essentially are is it's a way that you can modify and edit the behavior of the Unreal editor itself in blueprint formats. And so all of the windows that you
Oh,
see here,
interesting.
details panels, world settings, these buttons up here, you can make your own. And you also have access to the engine subsystem in those editor utility blueprints and stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a way in there in the editor utility widgets and editor utility blueprints would be
Mm.
the research areas to also automatically run your application in standalone or in the new editor window upon project start.
So my last question for game modes is kind of related to the question I asked earlier, which is that maybe a very simple answer, maybe not, but it almost feels like the game mode itself isn't as big of a player controller seems like a bigger concept that has more, I don't want to say value, but like you actually go into their player controller and build systems and architecture and code and all blueprints. Whereas I'd imagine game mode was something similar, but game mode almost seems like a collection of preset settings
Yep,
that basically
that's what it
tag
is.
in other elements in it. Is that a correct understanding of like that game mode overall?
That's a correct understanding of game mode. And it's generally a correct understanding of kind of the hierarchy of importance with what blueprints you're going to be coding on.
Mm-hmm.
With that said, really where most of your code's probably going to be is on that pawn or character. So player controller stuff, like if you look at projects that I work on, like player controller might have some stuff going on. It also might not. Probably though, like pause menu stuff, that general stuff. But I think for most people, getting into Unreal and even using Unreal in any sort of professional capacity, most of that code that you're working with, as far as the functionality, the features, getting things to work and run, you might as well just put on the player character,
Mm-hmm.
aka the player pawn.
And this is an interesting question because it kind of builds on this idea of just shifting your programming paradigm a little bit. Because would you say the same thing using that example I was mentioning of I have a computer, it lives in the back of, a server closet in a building. It's, generating some content that's being mapped to some lighting or some LEDs on a building. Because for me, I think, like, especially coming over from Touchdowner and Unreal and still trying to really grasp these player controllers and the object oriented hierarchy of things, I really like that tip, and I secretly I'm going to use that. I'm not going to graduate yet, but I really like the using the level blueprint as like the catch-all place a little bit when you're starting out. That feels real natural to me, but I get the sense like when you're talking about projects that, because in my mind, in a immersive environment where like I'm using Unreal for content generation, but there's no real like player to move in the level,
Mm-hmm.
I almost black out. It's like in a blind spot, the pawn
Mm-hmm.
and like all of its functionality. Whereas it sounds like from your side and your experiences, like a lot of functionality actually ends up on the pawn itself as opposed to in other places. Is that just something that you would recommend if folks are, coming even from a background of I make content and visuals in Unreal, but not specifically like controllable applications? Would you still recommend they kind of move towards, hey, let's think about the pawn as the place where, player controller gets the inputs and that's going to affect the pawn? Or would you say, hey, no, if you're really kind of just building these content applications without a lot of control, that, hey, you know what, like maybe you can leave player controller more or less empty. Maybe
Yep.
the pawn doesn't even do anything, and really you're either just making blueprints and dropping them in the world or using the level blueprint. Would you find that to be like bad practice?
Not necessarily bad practice. So the two most common places, if you're developing an Unreal Engine, that your code can be going and it's going to be fine, would be the level blueprint with the stipulation that your application is mostly just on one level and that's it.
Mm.
Because the thing about the level blueprint is like you try to go somewhere else and it's not, you can't reuse that code. You could duplicate the level and do that. So there's workarounds, but like code principle wise, if you do mostly environments or visual stuff, this kind of thing, I don't really see a problem with using the level blueprint for a lot of that stuff. As you get deeper into Unreal, you'll start to realize that it makes sense
Mm-hmm.
to kind of modulate out your code. That it makes sense. The second place, of course, is the player pawn or the player character, and I just want to show you on the screen
Oh yeah, cool.
why that's also important and super useful. So I'm going to go ahead and add a third person character. I did this in the last video or
Mm.
earlier this video, but it crashed. So here we are. So I'm going to open up the third person character blueprint. Okay, this is a pawn. So if I open this guy up, we have blueprint code. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
holding down right mouse button, zooming in and out, mouse wheel, great. And you can see it's already got some code prefabbed onto how this works. There's our viewport, the visual and physical manifestation of a particular blueprint class. You can see the parent class is character, and the parent class of that is pawn, which is why this is controllable, which is why if I
Mm-hmm.
look up input events like, the H key, stuff will come up, I can control it. But I want to show you just a quick way that you can do blueprint to blueprint communication. So let's say you are coding stuff on this third person character. You would make typically what we call a custom event, which is like its own node to do something. This custom event might say, make, I don't know, make character fast, whatever. Okay, so in this particular case, I have made a blueprint node that I can look up as long as I'm typing on this blueprint.
Mm.
And I
In
can
this
call
scope.
this
Yeah.
in this scope. And I'm going to show you how to break that scope in a second so
Mm-hmm.
that we can access this. So make character fast. All right. So I'll grab the character movement component and I'll say, hey, set max walk speed, which is the character speed from its default of 500, instead make it, or 600, instead make it 6,000. Okay, great. And so, I mean, you might use that for a typical sprint or something, whatever. And maybe you'd be, looking up left shift and then saying, hey, when this is, uh, I would like you to call make character fast when this is
Mm.
pressed. And then maybe you make a make character slow, which whatever, make character slow. And there are different creative ways that you might do this. Like I'm doing this for illustrations standpoint, where I'm going, hey, like I now have two custom events I could call. One called make character fast and then make character slow. Over time, like again, nothing wrong with that. But over time, you might save yourself some time. Like how I would do this today is I'd probably do this.
Set character speed or something, and then feed in like.
Yeah, feed in the input. Yeah, something like that. Or maybe I just say like toggle character speed, and then maybe I'll just do let's say, because let's say I know it's predefined speeds, I don't want those parameterized. And so I might do something like, hey, there you go. And then condition be like fast. And so now I only have one custom event, but whenever I call that custom, so instead of having to have two different ones, like I have here, make character fast, make character slow, whatever, and instead we'll just say character, toggle character speed, and then same event, but on one it gets inputted true and then on false. So yeah, this kind of like idea, or like you were saying, you do some sort of custom event where you feed in the value, and you might be seeing that I'm doing some things like some people will go here and they'll click the plus inputs. Of course you could do that, but use these shortcuts. I could drag this right here and bam.
That's a great one. I love that.
Yeah. So there's lots of ways of doing this. Anyway, the original thesis of why I was showing you all this was to say, hey, what if I'm not on the third person character blueprint? What if I want to make the character blueprint fast because I pressed a button in a menu? How do you do this? These are two different blueprints, right? So actually, let's go through that example. This would also apply to the level blueprint and this kind of thing. But let's do that. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new like widget, which is this is how you would make things show up on screen. We'll call this character control widget. Any sort of menu, HUD, this kind of stuff will always be a widget. And the first thing you do is you bring a canvas out. I'm going to go fast. I think at some point, if your audience is interested, we could do a whole video on widgets and best practices as well.
Absolutely.
So we'll go ahead and bring this button out. And if I press on the button, go ahead and anchor this at the bottom. I want to make the character fast or whatever. So we're going to communicate between two different blueprints. So first off, just because I made the widget doesn't mean that automatically I'm going to be seeing that widget show up on screen. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and make sure we're in third-person game mode, which we are. So we hit play. The widget doesn't show up immediately on screen. Let's go ahead and do, we could put this code on the level blueprint or the third-person character. Which one would you do?
I'm a sucker for this level blueprint trick. I'm not going to lie.
All right, we'll do level blueprint.
For my touch designer brain, because a lot of the young folks out there, young folks I'm speaking to you, when you're learning Unreal, learn it the right way. I am ingrained so deep in my touch designer ways. Once you said, you could put a lot of stuff in the level, we probably like, can I? Well, that's a problem solved. So and that's where I would put it. I guess because it's a menu thing, I would also still, in a proper practice, put it towards the level blueprint because it's bigger than the... I almost want to say put it in the player controller. Is it player controller? No, it doesn't have a player controller.
It could, but that would be if it was really universal. Like we said, a pause menu. That's totally player controller. Because, hey, if I change from third-person character to this other character and I didn't put now I got to put the widget code on that new blueprint. No, too much work. Put it on the player controller. Player controller never goes away. But... so yes, we could put this in either of these two places. So I'm going to put it on the level blueprint since you suggested that. The nodes are going to be the same. So when you do a widget, you're going to look up what's called create widget. I just did. I'll do that again. So create widget. It's a 2-node process. Create widget. Then you select the widget from all the widgets you've made. So we made one. I called it character control widget. And so there it is. And the next one is you have to add it to player screen or viewport, either works. So I'll go ahead and select that. And now if I hit play, that showed up on screen and I got this. Okay. I'm going to now program the communication, which is say, how do I put this code on the player character and now I want to talk to it. Again, the process is really easy, and it's actually easy because you are putting on the player character because we have nodes to get the player character. So in this case, I'm gonna scroll down the bottom of the details panel with this button selected. If you don't see the events here, this is a weird update recently in UE5. Just make sure you check mark is variable, and now the events will be there. It should be checked by default, but sometimes it's not. On clicked, on hovered, on pressed, all this good stuff. Anything a button can do. Okay. Again, we could do a longer widget video at some point, but on clicked. Now I want to somehow communicate to this entirely different blueprint. I want to talk to it. Now, what am I going to do? I want to call one of these custom events. So we'll do this one, toggle character speed, but how do I access it? Again, because it's a player character, you can just ask for the player character and then cast to it specifically. You have to cast to the specific blueprint that it is. Unreal doesn't know that you're playing third-person character instead of the flying pawn, instead of the boat, instead of the aircraft, instead of the car. So then, after you get the player character, you cast to third-person character. By the way, you also have get player pawn, same idea, same thing. If you were doing like the racing car template, that does not inherit from character, so you would have to do pawn. So let's just say more universally applicable would be pawn, because there's no chance
because pawn is the parent of the character class.
It's always the pawn. It always exists. Yes, exactly. Because a character is a little bit more specific. Character is up like vertical. It's got a capsule component because it's a character movement component. That's why Unreal gives you that, because it's such a common class. But your racing car is not going to be your pawn. Your default flying around a virtual environment isn't going to be a character, but it will be a pawn. So now that I've casted, why we like the cast node is off of here, I can drag off and I have access to any variables, any functions, and yes, any custom events that live on that blueprint. So I can go down here and I think we said something speed, toggle character speed. So now I can say, yes, you're fast. So if I were to hit play, oh, by the way, the mouse is going to go away for this. Now, we talked about before, I think in our other video, about player controllers and how I could go in and check mark all those buttons and stuff. I'm not going to do that. In fact, I think a faster way in this particular case is I'm just going to get the player controller, and then we're going to do 3 nodes. Okay, this is another one of those things, kind of like with widgets. You got to have these 2 memorized because you're going to make widgets show up on screen at some point. This is a 4-node process that you got to have memorized, because anytime you're like, I need my mouse cursor, or I don't need it, go away. This is the process. Get player controller, set show mouse cursor, 2 more nodes, set enable mouse over events, and then finally set enable click events.
Interesting. So then that gives you back control of interacting with the widget and what's in the viewer with your mouse.
Exactly, because if you notice before, I'm going to go and disconnect this. When I hit play, if I make the mistake of clicking once in, I lost my mouse, because
which is confusing because people watching the screen share are going to see the mouse, because
they see the mouse still.
Video
right now?
Ninja still captures the mouse, but I think everyone who's worked in Unreal knows once you click in there, you lose your mouse.
They've encountered this
until
problem,
you hit escape
probably.
And like get out. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. How to toggle a mouse cursor on and off. So this is the process for that. So we're just going to say, hey, mouse cursor in Unreal, stay on, as it does. But anyway, so I've got my mouse cursor. So I'm running slow, and now I'm going to click the widget, click, and pick up speed. Now I'm Superman. So we have just done blueprint to blueprint communication, and we like the character pawn or the character blueprint because you can do this little guy, this process. You could do this from your level blueprint, for example. We can go to level blueprint and you could do the same thing and talk to stuff. Also, because if your character exists on your level already, which it doesn't because it's being spawned, but let's say it did, you would be able to create a reference to
get the reference
whatever you selected like before. Yep.
Hey folks, thanks for watching. If you like our YouTube content, I highly recommend you check out the interactive and immersive HQ Pro. The HQ Pro is the only comprehensive educational resource and community for immersive design, touch designer, and creative tech pros. In the HQ Pro trainings, we cover almost any topic you can think of, and we go way more in depth than we do in our YouTube tutorials. We have a private group where Matthew Reagan, myself, and our other industry veteran and pioneer teachers answer your questions every single day. If that sounds cool, click the link in the description to learn more. And if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more free touch designer and immersive content.